I think that, at least in the case of deployments, unfortunately, it's a case that can very easily be affected by the pandemic. So to give you one big example of it, so back in July, there was actually a COVID outbreak, I guess 2 of them, at 2 different US Marine bases in Okinawa, right? And so this was something that actually created a lot of outrage among the community. And in fact, Okinawa's governor actually spoke out against it, because there was this concern that, while the Okinawan communities were being very careful and taking the pandemic very seriously, their perception was the Americans are not taking it seriously, right? And they're potentially endangering our communities. And so, again, that's an example of how that would be a negative interaction. And so that can do 2 different things, right? One is that the reaction from the military base, in this case from the Americans, might be to say, well, this just created this negative reaction. What do we do about it? Let's become more insular, right? So much like it happened after 9/11, where military bases became more closed off, service members were discouraged from stepping off base. We are, I'm guessing, are going to see more of that, right? So stay inside, don't go out. And it's good, at least in terms of not spreading disease, right? But we also know that in terms of civil-military relations between this foreign military presence and the communities, that can basically, you lose the opportunity for a lot of positive interactions, which of course you should, right? And in a pandemic, but you're not having those positive interactions, right? And so we know that in general, lack of transparency is bad for base community relations. And, whether it's lack of transparency and then the locals think that what you're doing is building a spy base in the Amazon to then invade Venezuela from, which is something we heard over and over in Panama when we were doing some field work there. That was the concern. Or whether in this case, you're being insular and you're not sharing information, and what they might start thinking is, well, they're not taking COVID seriously, and they might spread it to the community. And I think that has even happened within the US. My community were concerned about the military base and are they taking it seriously? So there is a potential for that. So we know that, for example, and in terms of the effect that might have on policy, for example, tried predicting protests, so anti-base protests, right? Because this is something that can make it more costly to have a military presence abroad if local communities are protesting against you. And what we found is that, well, first of all, predicting protest behavior is difficult. But what actually makes it easier to predict, it's not the things that you'd think about, which is, your age, your education, your gender, but experiences are actually the things that best predict protest, right? So were you the victim of a crime or things like this? And so if your experiences are negative ones, I think, the military is spreading COVID, that could lead, again, to more negative perception, more protests, which again, given that, both the US and other countries are more and more operating in a competitive environment when it comes to deployments, we may see less willingness by host countries to host these deployments, or at least as big of a deployment, or to allow them to expand it. And then just very briefly in terms of training, obviously, just like and PME, professional military education, just like all of our colleges, we've seen study abroad, military international exchange programs be suspended, right, at the Army, U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Leavenworth, which Colonel Laforêt is familiar with. We know they suspended some of these programs, switched over some classes to Zoom, just like any other colleges. And so given that a lot of what is happening there in terms of soft power is not just what you're learning, but having these interactions with host families and going out on field trips, again, you're losing some of that potential for those soft power interactions there.
So we had to work very hard in order to to make sure that first we all understood the problem from the same way, so that we can actually carve a way ahead that would make sense for all of us as a group. So that took us actually very little time. And reason for that is that as military professional, pandemic is only one of the factors that affect our movement moving forward. As we all know what our start state is. We all know where we want to go, and we all know there's going to be obstacles along the route. And pandemic just happened to be one. And for all of you that have done military planning or planning in any way or form before, we all know that we can find a way around most things. But I would tell you that from a personal experience, the GBA Plus training that we've done in the Against Armed Forces have helped me greatly navigate the complexities of the pandemic, at least when it came down to having a common understanding of what we had to do collectively with 9 nations. Obviously, when the pandemic struck, the one thing that we had to think about was to protect our force. And you know what? If we're not out there doing operations, the first duty of the soldier is to protect himself or herself. Because if he cannot get to the line of departure in the first place, is no use to the armed forces of who we are. So we've done a number of little things just to make sure that we're safe, including, for instances, we've ordered that every 2 hours, 10% of the force will be dedicated to cleaning patrols on camp. So every 2 hours, you've got about 150 soldiers moving around camp and cleaning everything that they can see and touch. Yeah, that's one thing in the sense that we all know that washing hands and cleaning surfaces is a key thing in order to mitigate the effects of COVID. But maybe more importantly, we all know that you cannot see COVID unless, I guess, you're a medical doctor and you're in the hospital. But having those 150 soldiers moving around every 2 hours with buckets of soap, it is a vivid reminder that there's something out there still going on. And that actually was a key nugget of activity that was taking place that reminded people that, hey, there's still something out there that threatens us, which is COVID. And we've been doing that for now 8 months. So for every 2 hours, yeah, we're quite a cleaning agency here. And here, actually, my last point would be about what Professor has said as well about the lack of interaction. And that may be leading to a gap in the soft power activities that we've got to do. Well, I think that we all agree that in the context of COVID, a lack of interaction is actually showing leadership. Social distancing, physical distancing, and all that is of the utmost importance. Just to give you an example of what we've done is that as soon as COVID struck in force back in March, for the next 4 months, we've actually confined all soldiers to camp. They were confined in that camp, living in a bubble. And then, yeah, Latvia is an amazing country, and they wanted to go out and tour the country, but they couldn't do it. I mean, we had to protect ourselves and limit the exposure to the outside world. Now, that didn't stop us from operating. We were still going out in military convoys, doing exercises, but obviously we were COVID mindful and, wearing masks and keeping our social distancing, but we had to stop the social interaction on the personal basis. But the reason why we could do that was because in the first place, I strongly believe that the Latvian people understand that we're committed to this mission set. And once again here, I would refer that back to the notion of deterrence and commitment being a key piece of it. When you look at everything that we've invested in Latvia over the past many years, including the fact that my wife and 2 kids actually are part of the economy here, and also that we have rotations moving in every 6 months and there's no end in sight. I mean, the Latvian population understand that we're doing the right thing, and we're showing leadership actually by confining ourselves. And yes, they might not see us downtown or having nice meals at the restaurant, but we all know this is only temporary.
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is that the extent to which the pandemic has changed the conduct of NATO operations varies from mission to mission. It might seem obvious, but I think it's worth stating. For the NATO mission in Iraq, for instance, the training and capacity building component has been put on pause, but the advisory function with the Ministry of Defense has kept going. To be honest, I don't think the pandemic is the sole factor here, because the security situation was deteriorating rapidly earlier in the year already, especially after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. The mobility of NATO troops was curtailed already before the pandemic even became an issue, but Iraq has suffered a lot from the pandemic, and this has certainly impacted the conduct of operations. What this means then for the work of the gender advisor who's deployed as part of the NATO mission in Iraq is that the training and education packages NMI was delivering in military academies back in 2019 when I visited had some content on women, peace, and security. This is no longer being done, but it's not the content on gender specifically, it's just that those types of training and capacity building efforts are not taking place at all right now. The GenAd can still influence the advisory role NATO plays with the Iraqi Ministry of Defense by working with individual NATO military and civilian advisors, and the commander can highlight women, peace, and security objectives in her key leader engagements. And you had Major General Carignan not too long ago as part of your series, Theo, so you would be familiar with that. So my sense is that the GenAd's role in this context is more focused on internal training and familiarization within the NATO mission, rather than being more outward facing, conducting activities with Iraqi forces or the community. That's just the nature of the situation and the current constraints. Beyond the activities of the GenAd or the promotion of the women, peace, and security agenda, the pandemic has impacted NATO activities in a number of ways. The Alliance has provided medical equipment and PPE at the request of partner states, and we were seeing those requests come in throughout the spring. The pandemic has disrupted troop rotations, and the pandemic affects caveats, meaning what NATO members are allowed to do on the ground. So they have different types of instructions, and those vary from country to country. Not all member states have adapted to the pandemic in the same way, and NATO now has to coordinate these changes and account for these differences in terms of their operational planning efforts. So overall, there were delays, some operational pauses, canceled activities, but it's not caused NATO to completely rethink its operations in the way that we might have thought. I think that the pandemic also presents an opportunity for certain missions to appear even more responsive to community level needs. And that's certainly where a gendered lens would come into play, identifying new vulnerabilities as a result of COVID-19 that NATO forces can address. So KFORS is a good example of that. It's been extremely active in the response to in the wake of the pandemic. For example, and you can track this on social media, they post pictures, there's a lot of information that's available even now. KFOR's Italian military contingent provided family health centers with medical equipment, whereas before they may have gone out to communities and provided soccer balls. So you see a bit of shift in the nature of those activities. Since the beginning of the pandemic, health institutions in Kosovo have received PPE from the NATO-led mission and aid from allied and partner nations, because it's not just NATO operating there. KFOR has also continued providing assistance to other organizations like NGOs, and in October, so very recently, Italian soldiers also donated laptops to the Ministry of Education to contribute to the development of distance learning in Kosovo. So these are just some examples to illustrate the adaptation of mission tasks to the pandemic without fundamentally changing the actual nature of the mission there. And then this is just a bit of a guess, but I would suspect that of all the places NATO has soldiers deployed, enhanced forward presence has probably had the least disruptions or changes in their activities. They can just keep going with exercises in their training area. So long as the soldiers have done their quarantine and exercise appropriate precautions, they can carry on. Maybe that makes for less interesting outings on the weekends, but for now, I think that's an important precaution to take. But of course, I defer to Colonel Laforêt on that. He's already gave us a glimpse of how the pandemic has affected his activities. It's probably impacted Task Force Latvia's activities more than the actual battle group activities in Adaji. But again, maybe Colonel Laforêt can speak more to that a bit later. And I think the Canadian framework nation concept is a little bit different maybe than the others in that particular respect and in that structure. Okay, I'll stop here.